Quetzal says, with great certainty, the 20th century will bring no scientific insight relating to this. However, it will look different after the turn of the millennium, as a future viewing of a related form has proven. Billy says, then we'll see. One asked about Glenn Miller. He was a jazz musician who disappeared one day during the war, without a trace, and was declared as missing. Can you give any information about this? Because to this day, it is still puzzling as to where this Glenn Miller disappeared. Quetzal says, about that, I can explain a few things to you, as it concerns a man who was a musician and, thus, one who falls into our art records. Glenn Miller was inadvertently killed by his own people, that is, by Allied forces, on his way from England to France. He was on his way to Paris to attend a Christmas celebration. He flew his aircraft very low over the English Channel, as American Lancaster aircraft dropped their surplus bombs into the English Channel, without the crews noticing that beneath them, a smaller aircraft crossed their flight path. This aircraft, in which Glenn Miller sat, was hit by the dropped bombs, upon which it exploded, was torn into the smallest pieces, and then plunged into the sea. The small pieces of debris were scattered hundreds of meters, while Glenn Miller was completely torn apart into the smallest particles. This is the real truth, which has no relation at all to the false story that Glenn Miller, for indefinable reasons, died in the arms of a prostitute in Paris. Unfortunately, this misrepresentation had also been circulating in our archives, which also could have resulted in misunderstandings, to which even our people could be forfeited, if they would only examine a few facts and not the whole complex. Billy says, it's nice that mistakes can even occur with you in such matters, which might be enough to prove that even you are not omniscient or omnipotent. Thus, I am glad to hear your confession. Quetzal says, we stand by our mistakes. Billy says, a strong feature of yours. Unfortunately, with the Earth people, that isn't exactly a strength, for they don't like to admit mistakes. Rather, they presume themselves as flawless and as better than everyone else, to whom they point out any mistakes. Quetzal says, that is well known to me. What I would still like to report to you is that I have received copies of your 5 novels from Patha, which I did not fail to read and which I find to be very good. And since I know so many things from your life, I naturally also found out that you have included a variety of life experiences and events in the novels, although you've made novel-appropriate changes and wordings. I already knew for a long time, which I also told you recently, that you led a very adventurous and often dangerous life. Also, during your younger years, you were connected with 3 companions in an open and unofficial alliance. May I talk about this at all? Billy says, I have nothing against that, my friend, even if it means that old memories break through, which has all really happened as a result of your words and has caused an ache in me. Yet that is normal, and so, I have nothing against it if you want to talk about it. I overcame the suffering and sadness, so only an ache appears when I am reminded about it. Quetzal says, then I may ask you about it? Billy says, of course, nothing opposes that. Quetzal says, thank you. I find it difficult to ask the questions. Billy says, simply state these in such a way as you think them. Quetzal says, all like I wanted to ask you, well, it was such that all 3 companions of your early years were taken from you. Billy says, don't be so heavy, my friend. Yes, it's true what you say. For the first time, it happened in Algeria, when I made an open alliance with Samira, an Arab girl, and went through the desert with her, away from her family, in order to return to Europe. Then, in a small oasis, it happened Samira was bitten by a poisonous snake and died shortly after that. In the small, nameless oasis, there was neither a doctor nor any people, only 3 palm trees and some bushes, as well as a damp spot in the sand, which I dug out, after which some water collected in the trough. Alone with Samira's corpse, I excavated a pit with my dagger, in which I then buried my companion. morning, I spent some more time at the place, in order to move on after that and return to Europe, where it didn't keep me for long, nevertheless. Consequently, I traveled along again on unknown paths in the Middle and Near East, so to Arabia and later to India. 1.5 years after Samira's death and burial, in the south of India, I became acquainted with Nadja, an Indian girl who belonged to the Hindu religion, which was a stark contrast to Samira's Islamic religion. Making a long excursion with Nadja into a mountainous jungle, we became a couple and were connected. After a few days, we rested at a river, where I built a small hut, in which we then lived. Then, it happened the monsoon season came somewhere. A severe thunderstorm was raging, causing the river to rise and rage loose within the shortest time, just when I had climbed up a tree on a hill, in order to explore the nearer and further environment. At that same time, Nadja was in the hut preparing a meal. As I saw from the tree how the foaming floods of the river raged near with tremendous gargling and roaring. Obviously having become attentive, I saw how Nadja stepped in front of the hut and uttered a shrill cry. That was the last I saw and heard of her, for 2 or 3 seconds later, the roaring waters shot over the small hill where the hut and Nadja were located, overwhelming them and causing them to disappear in the floods. Quetzal says, I did not know these events exactly. It makes me sorry to see you in such a way as you tell me everything. You still feel grief and pain, even if you say that you've mastered everything. So you also don't have to talk any further because it's enough for me to know that your third companion, Angela, lost her life in a small oasis in the Iraqi desert by a murderer's hand, as you described it in one of your novels. Billy says, Quetzal says, it's all right, dear friend. Anyhow, I find it good that you have partially written down these events, even if you partially had to change them appropriately for the novel. Billy says, it helped me a lot to process everything since it also isn't such that I could forget it, like also many other things, situations, incidents, and events. However, I simply cannot become lord over the pain when my memories surface. So you are quite right when you say that grief and pain are still present, but they are just not in the way as they were at the time of the events, when I plunged into the deepest abysses. And I know that this pain will still accompany me my whole life. Quetzal says, unfortunately, there is much more pain and grief and disappointment to come, for you cannot avoid the coming things and events, the great amount of betrayal and jealousy, falsehood, lies and deceit, as well as breach of trust, breach of love, and other things, like also not your duty, for you have to endure everything in order to fulfill your mission. But I will tell you what you need to prepare yourself for starting from today, so that you are armed and won't break, for these will be harsh events and issues that you will have to encounter. But for my part, I already know you very well and know that you will get through everything because you've acquired the capacity to deal with things rationally and always to confront them with logic and reason, as though they unexpectedly approached you, namely when you know what's coming in advance. Translator's note: for comparison to my independent translation, Dyson Devines and Vivian Legg's unofficial but authorized English translation of lines 34-50 above can be read here. Billy says, all right, enough about that. May I still ask you something? The matter is of general interest because it has often been asked of me whether I knew anything regarding the sect guru Sri Raneesh, also known as Bhagwan, who is actually called God on my part. I have christened him Bhagwan. He functions with his horde sects, with which I mean group sects. Bhagwan actually comes from the old Indian word Bhagavan, which simply means God or the Almighty, and this Bhagwan/Bhagwan is actually called Sri Bhagavan, but to my knowledge, he bears the name Chandra Mohan Raneesh. Unofficially, his sect, which it is in truth, calls itself the Neo-Sannyas movement. In 1981, Bhagwan established himself, along with his sect followers, in Oregon, USA, where he founded a city Raijneeshpuram, where he was banished and expelled again last year, however, and since then, he has been searching for a new hideout in different countries.